Hi, I'm Brian Maddox. I'm the host of the Consulting Trap podcast. I am joined today with Sean Boyce, the founder of Podcast Chef, and one of our early clients, Jeff Sirkin of Sirkin Research. Welcome, fellas.
Thanks for having me.
So let's kind of cut right to the chase. Jeff, can you tell us a little bit more about your firm, how you got started, where you're going, where you've been? That would be very helpful for our listeners.
Sure. So I am a data analyst turned data-driven marketer. And so as a result, something that I found in my own career as a marketer in my last stop in a full-time job, where I recognized that it was really that what was holding me back was not understanding my audience well enough. And so when I was in the full-time job, developing really a data-driven methodology for how I could better understand what mattered most to my audience and then help me reverse engineer the marketing. It worked really well in that particular case. We doubled the revenue of the company. We're able to sell it. And for me, it sort of said, well, wait a second, this is really a thing that other marketers could use. And so, for about the last 4 years or so, been out on my own, helping other marketers to be able to understand what matters most to their buyers.
Not to get too heavy into it, but I want to ask, because it's important, I think, for a lot of the folks that are listening, the prospects or the consultants or the folks that are listening to the show. How did you find your first couple clients?
Yeah. So to be honest, I was fortunate that I had a good referral network, right? Just, frankly, when I was starting out on my own, I had been doing side consulting work for 7 or 8 years at that point. So I had former colleagues, coworkers, former clients of mine that had been in a bunch of other places. And so, I had sort of a stable to get started with, but that certainly wasn't going to be enough to really grow the business. And honestly, one of the first things I did was recognize that I wanted to play the long game, that this was not going to be something I was going to be in and out very quickly. And so for me, one of the first things, and thanks, frankly, to you guys was really being able to start a podcast was ultimately one of the first real decisions I made from a business development perspective. And it's honestly the thing that has changed the most of my business.
So you raised a really important point. At what point did you decide, what kind of intelligence did you use? What were the signals that indicated you needed to stop relying on the referral network and add this, podcasting or whatever it was as a piece to your marketing plan?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me was more a matter of control, right? Referrals are great, but there's really no rhyme or reason for when they come in. And I've been fortunate that sometimes I will have a couple in a month or a quarter that kind of show up out of nowhere, but I knew I needed to get in front of that regardless. Right? I needed to build a strategy for myself where I could build a network that I could count on and be able to really create real relationships with people, whether there are people I might want to do business with as a client, as a partner, or even just to deepen, my network. All of those have really been benefited to me. But yeah, it was something that I recognized I couldn't just survive. It was different when I was doing it as a side hustle, right? Like where all I needed to do was fill a certain number of hours in a week. And frankly, even if I couldn't, it wasn't that big of a deal. I had full-time jobs, but now when this was going to need to pay the bills, I knew I needed to have more scope than I was able to carry. And I wanted to have more control over it.
It's the holy grail, right, of small business consultants is the predictability and reliability for new biz.
Yeah, 100%.
It's outrageously difficult to get to. So how has podcasting changed your perspective on that? What have you done? How did it work when you got started?
Yeah, so first and foremost, I think it's a funny story. Sean and I had a couple of conversations, and it probably took me until about the third conversation where it finally clicked in my mind, the idea, because I think I was sort of stuck in this notion of what a podcast is, and this notion that a podcast is this vehicle that you need to get thousands of listeners to in order to sell ads, and that's how you make money as a podcaster. It really hadn't struck me the idea of, no, the podcast will actually help create the network because it's about the guests that you're able to have on, and it's about creating a niche where the topic is very specific to the industry that you're looking to serve. And so honestly, a lot of that came from with Sean's help, and that was really how this all developed, at least initially.
It was an awesome journey to take together, Jeff. You've hit the nail right on the head in terms of basically why the value proposition with Podcast Chef was designed the way that it was. You told a very similar arc. Same story myself when I was building my original consulting business. Was I relied on my referral network. I did a lot of in-person networking. That was great. It was effective to an extent, but it was super unpredictable, right? And like that, just the anxiety alone of not knowing necessarily where my next project is going to come from. And then the trap where it comes from, the whole name of this podcast is because as soon as you get busy with work, isn't that stuff starts to pay off because you just put in that much effort, right? Now it takes you away from what you were doing in order to find that work, right? So it becomes one of those things where it's a brutal like trap to fall into, where as soon as you get busy, now all of a sudden it's like, okay, this is great, but what happens when those projects end up and then your heart sinks and it's like, oh, now what? Where's the work going to come from next? Really wanted something that was able to be, I was able to kind of be able to manufacture the kind of demand that I wanted. I didn't need like a crazy number of clients, but I did want to be able to find clients somewhat consistently based on a certain amount of input that I put into the process, that I could be as busy as I wanted to whenever I wanted to be. That was kind of the whole idea behind it. And you hit the nail on the head with the networking element, right? So like people do business with who they want to do business with. And podcasting is just that much more of an effective way to network with people because you can offer them more value. You don't lead with the whole, hey, you buy this, as I like to describe it, because no one wants to be approached in that way.
That's
right?
it.
We're selling, but at the end of the day, like what we really should be doing is building relationships, building networks with folks. So you explained it perfectly well, and it was an awesome opportunity to kind of learn together where we could improve and we could help you. So that experience was amazing. I'm super curious to hear more from you in terms of like what your experience has been like so far, and like what you can tell us in terms of performance that investing in this channel has done for your business.
Yeah, I think, and even just to go back to the beginning, one of the funny things is, as I think about it, it was when you and I were first having this conversation a couple of years ago, it was early in the pandemic. And it was this idea, to your point, of it was taking away our ability and my ability specifically to do any kind of in-person networking. And the funny thing that now that I look back on it is to say, I don't know why this wouldn't have been something I would have thought of otherwise, right? The fact that now this opened up the fact that it wasn't just, I live in Philadelphia, right? So, but this opened me up. I've had guests on that are all across the world. And frankly, if I think about it, where is my client base? Are they in Philadelphia? No, right? They're all across the world too. And so ultimately this, frankly, the digital platforms allows you to get closer to them. And so for me, first and foremost, I will say when I started, as a lot of other people did, I didn't totally know what I was doing, right? And I wanted to kind of feel it out. And so I had people on that I knew, some friendlies, but honestly, Sean, you really gave me sort of the kick I needed to say no. Like the whole idea is you need to kind of get out of your network, and so honestly, like one of the things I think about a lot, to your point, is just as it relates to business development. If I were to reach out to somebody that seemed like an interesting prospect for my business, and then said, "Hey, do you want to hop on a Zoom for an hour or 40 minutes so I can pitch you on my services?" No thanks, right? No thanks, stranger on LinkedIn. But now when I get to say, "Hey, now do you want to have a conversation? I have a podcast and I want to focus this episode on this particular topic that you happen to be an expert in," it's really twofold. One is, and Sean, this is part of the process, but I host an intro meeting with them, right? So where I get to have a half hour and I get to do a pre-interview, but more than anything else, this really allows me to create a real relationship. So I'm not just showing up to hit record and ask the same, kind of like whatever I'm able to research about them. I'm able to start with that, but then see where the conversation goes. And now when we get into the episode, probably about a week or two later, now there's real rapport there, right? Now I can even reference things that we've already talked about. So it really does make the episodes better. It truly deepens the relationship. And then at the end of it, allows me to say, yeah, in a soft way, if you haven't shown any interest yet, hey, here's who I am and here's what we do. And if you're interested now or in the future, happy to help. And, but again, but ultimately that's not the end all be all. And Sean, to your point around sort of the control over the demand, I've thankfully now gotten to a place that I do have a good amount of demand. And I'm sure I'll come back to this, but almost all of that, frankly, has been driven by the podcast. But now I'm at a place where it's not as much of, I need this next guest to be the next client of mine. That's not really the way I view it. It's, I'm approaching this like I would of networking, where I'm planting seeds. I'm sort of placing a bet on something like this, and maybe it'll grow, maybe it won't, maybe it'll turn into a partnership, maybe it'll turn in. I've had guests that became employees. I've had, it kind of can go a number of different ways. It's not just exclusively around this is a potential client and here's exactly the way I see it going.
Super well said. I love the kind of like hunting versus farming analogy, I almost call it, that you described it, Jeff. And I think a lot of us in the work that we do, we want to live this like the farming element, right? When we're comparing the two of those, hunting is exciting for various reasons, but farming is so much more sustainable when it comes to the work that we want to do. And you've done a great job of describing how it can turn into so many different things because you're starting to build this relationship, right? There may or may not be an opportunity to help now, but even if there isn't, that when they need that in the future, or if they're going to need that at some point, who are they going to think of, right? They have the best, strongest relationship with you at the moment. Plus, you've already invested in that relationship. You've given them a platform to share their message, spread the good word as well also. So everybody wants to, return the favor whenever possible. So even if they're out and about and they hear someone else and thinking, oh, that person sounds like it's a good match for Jeff's value proposition. So good relationship with them. I can connect those dots as well too, right? The magic really starts to, as I'd like to say it when describing it for people, the kind of value they can get out of this process. It's it has a compounding effect once you kind of start that process, especially when you do things like, you're sharing the guest episode and they're sharing it on your behalf, tagging you. You get a whole lot of interactivity. Like you said, Jeff, potentially in a whole other area geographically or market segment of people now learning about you, your show. Also, they could also become guests for the show. It's like it almost quickly becomes overwhelming. Process and manage the momentum, right?
It totally is. And to your point, I love the concept of this podcast in general, the fact that it, to some extent does become a trap because yes, it does become a little overwhelming. But at the same time, if I think back 2 years from now, these are problems I would have paid to have. Right. Totally. So, and now I'm here. And honestly, I mean, so much because to your point, like I've had guests that out of the blue, referred me to other people. And now some of them are my, when I think about my client base, honestly, I really do think that something like 90+% of my revenue from the first half of this year alone is from people either directly or indirectly through podcast guests, period. But to that point of, it is farming and you can't know when the plants are ready to grow, right? I had a client who had on the show well over a year ago. And at the time she was at a role as a CMO and, that company wasn't ready to do anything and it was totally fine. And we built a relationship. And then literally almost a year later, she reaches out and says, hey, I'm starting a new job at this company and we'd love to do business together. Great. And, so again, and now we're on our second project with them this year. But it's that thing of, you can't necessarily have an expectation because I think so much of it is the way you approach it, right? Because this approach really fit my style too. I don't like doing pushy sales. I couldn't be a hunter if I wanted to. That wouldn't be my game. And so this for me really matches stylistically where I'm able to have a real conversation and get to know people. That's more my style anyway. And then at the end of it, I'm able to softly put it out there. I want them to feel like it's their idea. I don't want to feel that they were pushed or pressured into it, or that was the reason that I had them on. So, again, it's the priority is creating a relationship first and whatever comes out of that is great.
Love it. And, I see countless examples over platforms like LinkedIn and otherwise where I'm sure you are as well too. We all are at this point, right? Where we're getting hounded by messages and paragraphs long and it's, buy this, buy that. Here's all this stuff. And I'm just like, we don't know anything about each other. I don't know anything about you. How are you going to start a relationship by like, look at me, right? Like, look at me, look how important I am. And it's like, I have 50 of those people reaching out to me every day sometimes. And it's like, instead of that, you wouldn't go up to somebody more than likely on the street and just be like, hey, you like buy all this stuff, right? Like for whatever reason, it seems to be commonplace on these social media platforms. And LinkedIn is like one of the worst offenders, which really can help your message stand out from the crowd when it's no longer about them, right? The message that you're asking is, you want to be a guest on my podcast? Now it's about you, right? Like, that's right. I want to feature you, right? So that stands out like bold and caps in the best way, right? So like it cuts through the noise and enables you to establish a real connection with someone. And then you could start building the network in that way. And like you said, it doesn't enter that realm of that, like, sleazy car sales kind of, pushy, anything like that. It's just about meeting great people, telling cool stories, networking. And then if there's opportunity to work together, great, right? Like you said, if it isn't also great, right? We know each other, we can help each other in other ways. But if we've got our kind of aim kind of dialed in here, chances are I may or may not be meeting you at a good time where, we can work together. I can help you solve problems. And to that other point you made as well too, where it's like it really starts to build a lot of momentum, which is exciting. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that as well too, in terms of like what the phases were in progress on your end. But different about this time around, as opposed to the original, like, basing your growth almost exclusively off of referrals, is you have more control over it, right? Where if it starts to produce more, you can pull back in terms of like reaching out to folks and throttling it back a little bit. And if it starts to calm down or you want to grow more, you can throttle it back up. So it gives you that element of control, versus before it was kind of out of your control. So I think that's probably a key difference. I'm curious to know whether or not that's been your experience as well.
Completely. And I think for me, the way I think about it is, I do have an understanding of the guests I want to have on and what the potential, I am, to be honest, I am thinking about what potentially could, what could be the outcomes of this, right? And so there are some people that are a little more purely sort of in a business development category. And then there are others that, are maybe almost purely intentionally like just people I want to have on, or like what I've actually done, sort of the beginning of this year, especially, is I was sort of stocked with all the client work I could handle, which is a great problem to have. And so for me, it was like, but I love doing the podcast. I do. So I didn't even necessarily want to slow down in terms of doing the episodes, but it was really just sort of changing the types of guests I had on. And so I really saw it as more of, I want to broaden and learn myself, right? So I would have people on, I work with marketers, but I wanted to learn more about specific topics around like product-led growth and how to build content strategy. And so I would have people on that could speak to those really specialties. And for me, I was really learning, right? Like I could know enough about those things that I knew some of the buzzwords, but I wanted to learn them more myself. So I was having people on that, were almost intentionally not people that I would potentially do business with, or at least not directly, at least not now. There were people that were a little earlier in their career that I wanted to give a chance to feature, and I wanted to learn something from experts that are in their specialty. And so I think that's how I've really sort of tweaked it over time. And yeah, now as I'm coming to the end of some of that client work, like now I am, kind of a little back in more of the intent of, I always have sort of a list of future prospective guests. And so now let me find some of the ones that maybe would be more of a sooner sort of business development kind of target.
Super cool.
That leads me to two questions that I think would be of interest to our listeners, particularly folks that are kind of just going on that podcast journey. First, and I'll ask them both, and then I'll remind you in case you get stuck. But the first, because it happens, right? The first question is, how has the content of your podcast kind of evolved since you started? And second, you mentioned using your podcast now as a tool. What other sort of problems have you solved with your podcast? So I'm interested in kind of both of those.
Yeah. So I'll start with the first, which is really how the content has changed. One of the things I will say is I think when I was starting this, I felt imposter syndrome is the best way to say it, where I felt that I wasn't sure I had any sort of expert opinion to share. And so I really took the approach of, I want to have on experts that I can kind of pick their brain, let them sound smart, and hopefully I can just say something smart in return, but basically kind of shape the content around that person's story, their career journey, things like that. And so then over time, as I became more confident with my own voice and knowing that what I had to share was more relevant and that I felt more confident wanting to put that out, I had more people on that we could have an even discussion about industry topics. And so we've shifted away a little bit from somebody's journey as much as how do they get to the position they're in, because part of that was just my excuse of A, making it even more about them, and B, letting them kind of almost dictate the content of each episode. And now I kind of come at it from a 50-50. I see it like a Venn diagram of what are the topics that I consider myself to be knowledgeable on and excited about talking about, and what do they too? And then again, that's also partially what I get out of the introduction meeting is I get to hit on a bunch of little topics, and I get to find out where some of those, sort of those more fruitful areas are. And so now I'm able to build the episodes around where we do kind of still do some of the initial high level stuff just to establish their credibility. But then I want to move as quickly as possible into some of these big picture topics of what's affecting marketers, right, in my world. And so, but that's been a really intentional and dramatic shift, even if, to the listener, they may not even notice as much. But for me, I think it's been, night and day, honestly. But I don't think I would have been prepared to do this version of it right away. I think it's something that I realized over time doing it. And so, yes, I did forget the second question.
See, look, this is good. But so we'll get to the second question again now that I got question 1A in mind. And,
perfect.
And question 1A is, You talked about imposter syndrome, and that's something that's like outrageously common amongst all consultants. It's a recurring theme. Have you had the same experience I've had? I mean, I'm meeting with folks that are way above what I perceived my original weight class to be.
Yep.
Like, I am punching way out of what my original league was with some of my podcast guests. Have you had the same experience?
Oh, totally. And one thing, just in my own career, just to take a step back, I did, big company consulting. I worked at Accenture early in my career. And one of the things I found shortly after that is when I was in other full-time jobs, people would sort of see my experience as being so much more valuable. And one thing that I really took from that is that, having 5, 10, 20 years of experience in one company, you're getting really deep. But frankly, it's recognizing how applicable some of those things are in other situations. And so for me as a consultant, and something I learned very early on, that I really liked having perspective that was a little wider and being able to say that, yes, I know that you are a special flower because you are in this industry that you think nobody can understand unless they're there. But I think there's like an idea in literature that there's only like 7 unique storylines. And I've started to see the same when you do enough consulting, you start to see the same in business, right? So it's like, yes, I know that you're a large healthcare company, but I've actually seen the same in a growth stage SaaS company, right? And here's how we solve that. But so recognizing, sort of the problems are all very similar. And frankly, for me, it's having the broad scope of seeing more of them. Sure. So I don't necessarily have as deep an expertise, but I think I bring a different layer to it of sort of a broader perspective of seeing maybe some of those same things across industries. And frankly, being able to, I was just listening to another podcast earlier, and the idea that it was comparing marketing to medicine in the 1800s, that essentially where everything was an N of one, right? So everything was based on specific observations of one doctor and then being able to put that into practice. But really where the value came from in medicine, and when medicine actually took off to what we think of it today, is when they started recognizing like, well, how do we kind of standardize across these things? And how do we see across patients and do standardized testing and blind trials? And, but ultimately it's about having that broader perspective that actually it's different. But to me, I think part of it is recognizing that it's no less valuable necessarily, even if my total years of experience or anything like that don't match some of the people that I've on.
And now for the illustrious second question. So you started with podcasting solving a very specific problem for you and your business. But if your experience is anything like mine, and I expect that it is, it's solved novel problems as well. So what's the surprise problem that podcasting has solved for you, or the surprise connection that you've been able to make?
Yeah, I think, and maybe this isn't as much of a surprise, but I think what I'm really drawn to are things like podcasts. And actually, we're still in the process, and very similarly, of writing a book, and for a very similar reason, which is that it really bestows this credibility upon you, right? So the idea that now, like having a podcast and having some of the guests I've had on and having done it for a year and a half at this point, now gives me the credibility to go speak at conferences, let's say, right? Like it gives me sort of a leg up in terms of, in this way where basically the market has now bestowed this credibility upon me, this authority. Oh, I must be an expert in marketing because I've talked to, 50, 60 marketers on my podcast over the last year and a half. So, it's one of those things where if you could get those people to come on, if these people, and essentially, like, I don't have to say it, but just, if those people are in your personal Rolodex, if you could reach out to them and you have real relationships with them, then it's almost like this, and frankly, because in parallel, I've been sort of building my own personal presence on LinkedIn, which is a very similar kind of methodology where you're playing the long game. It's taking time to start building those connections, and it's how much can you create content that's going to resonate with your specific, ideal customers, not just, sort of more broadly. And so it's not inspirational stuff, but it's very specific to my market. But again, I think all of these really work together, and it's really like it becomes the network effect of that. So that having now grow, you can grow a following on LinkedIn because you have a podcast and you're connected to these other people, but then you can get invited on other podcasts. You can speak at conferences because now you have a big LinkedIn network and a podcast. And so it's all of these things almost, it's sort of this almost like self-fulfilling prophecy that each one of these kinds of fuels the other one, but it becomes this, really very positive, sort of what's the opposite of I'm totally blanking on the word I'm trying to think of. It's like not the, anyway, I can't think of it.
Yeah, podcasting is a multiplier and has a compounding effect for sure. Absolutely. So, Jeff, I think as we start to hit our target sort of time length here, making sure that we target these podcasts to make sure that if you need to walk the dog, you have enough time to hear a whole episode. So I want to make sure we get to exactly that point. But there are going to be folks that want to talk to you more. Mm-hmm. They want to hear more about you. They definitely, a lot of our listeners are like, oh yeah, I heard the podcast that you had for this other person that used to be on your show or what have you. Can you tell us a little bit more about who should reach out to you and how they should get a hold of you and where they can find you?
Yeah. So I'd say mostly B2B marketers. If you're in a position where you're not exactly sure how to get into a market and win, if you're struggling with having content that resonates, if you're not really driving the demand you want to be, fundamentally, we believe it's the root cause of that is not understanding your audience well enough. So our process will help you uncover the pain points, the priorities, and the phrasing of your market that will help you be able to reverse engineer your messaging and content for them. And it's truly the only way to create new demand.
Love that. I love the data-driven storytelling aspect, Jeff, as well, too. And you guys do such a phenomenal job of it, which begs the obvious question before we get out of here. I want to hear you talk more about what we've been talking about. Tell us more about your podcast. What's the name? Who do you have on it? What kind of stories do you tell? Where can people find more about your show?
Yeah. So the podcast is called Long Story Short. We typically, we're all about storytelling and connection. It's how businesses tell stories effectively. And so we have marketing leaders, entrepreneurs, and social impact advocates. So that's typically our guests, and it's typically targeted. The audience is really for marketers. It's people that are trying to tell stories themselves, and it's how our guests are able to connect effectively with their audiences to get their stories to resonate as well. And it's available on essentially any podcast platform you listen to. Long story short.
Amazing. Thank you, Jeff. Definitely check out Jeff's podcast. It's fantastic. Some of the stories on there are excellent. Big fan of trying to crack the marketing code myself as well, too. So your podcast has been a big help, having all the experts, including yourself, on there to share those insights with us. Really invaluable advice. And then last question on my end is going to be, what's the best advice you have for people that maybe even wanted to a certain extent, kind of get started with podcasting, but haven't done so yet for one reason or another? If you think back to, where you were back then, what's some of the best advice you'd have for your past self or anybody else who might be kind of in that area at the moment and considering it themselves?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things, and it kind of goes back to the imposter syndrome, is to recognize that wherever you are, whatever you're doing, that there's somebody that would value from it. There's somebody that would value from your experience. And so being able to share your story, whether you are, and I saw something, if you're a six-figure business, that being able to help anybody who's not quite there yet. If you're a five-figure business and starting a side hustle, there's always somebody who can benefit from your experience, somebody who would. So don't be afraid to start putting that out there. And that's something it took me, frankly, even a year of doing this before I felt more comfortable putting my own story, making my own story part of this. But it's something that I've recognized and I've gotten a lot more value out of. So, just recognize that there's people that will get value from what you have to share.
Some advice. Thank you, Jeff.
Awesome. Thank you, gentlemen, for being on the show today. Sean, welcome back. We'll have you on as a regular. And Jeff, please feel free, as you gain more knowledge and insight about podcasting and your experience in that space, please don't hesitate to come back. We'll get you back on the show.
Love to.
Thanks, gentlemen.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Consulting Trap. If you have suggestions for future episodes or would like to be a guest on our show, please send me an email at brian@podcastchef.com. That's BRIAN at podcastchef.com. Before we go, we'd like to thank the sponsor of our show, Podcast Chef. Podcast Chef helps turn ordinary podcasting into a revenue-generating lead magnet for your consulting business. Our Podcasting Done For You service takes away the headache of starting up and running your own podcast. Reach out now to take advantage of our 30-day money-back guarantee. Visit us at podcastchef.com to find out how our team of experts can help you leverage podcasting to take your business to the next level.